All right, we had to take a break because that room was being used, so we're back again. All right, so I was talking about the sibling. So the sibling brought up the fact that she was raised as a teenager doing something called the Purity Movement. And the Purity Movement was something that happened really in the evangelical church, where there was this huge emphasis on purity before marriage, so no sex before marriage. And a lot of people were giving purity rings, and you went to these purity dances with your dad, and I was raised in it as well, so I can speak a little bit about it, but it really was that sex is amazing, but only if you wait until marriage, and then it just absolutely blows your mind. And she brought that up, how that like you were really told that, and marriage became really sexualized. And so now when you have two people who don't fit that mold, she got really confused, right? Like, what does that do? Because I have a brother who's gay now. Like, how does that impact him? And she goes, and then it just kind of gave me this ick factor because marriage is about sex. And if it doesn't fit this, then what is that? Which I thought was really interesting because it gave a different generational twist. So, the third set of findings was around the issues of family. And the families reported that they felt like they had an increased strength and bond with the family due to in-depth conversations. The church had denied conversations. And in fact, one individual she was an elder, and she went and she tried to have a conversation, and she said they just looked at me. They didn't even acknowledge that I had told a story. They didn't even acknowledge, like, that must be hard for you. Like, she was like, it was crickets. Like, they just didn't speak to me. And they were crying out for this conversation. We want a dialogue. We want conversation, and they weren't allowed to have it. So then the conversation started happening at home. But even when the conversations were happening at home, there were certain things they weren't allowed to talk about because a lot of the gay and lesbian children were no longer going to church. They weren't practicing a faith anymore. And then that became a taboo subject. So there was a lot of things that they could talk about, and then things that they couldn't talk about, and places that they could talk about and not. And most of the participants started reporting when those conversations happened, it forced an authenticity that they had not practiced in the family before. And that felt really good. It forced them to be authentic and honest with each other. And that helped them. That made them stronger. The next theme was the concern with dealing with family members. Probably one of the most heart-wrenching stories I heard was a mother whose son had come out, and they were getting ready to go to her daughter's wedding, and they were traveling back to see her parents. And she said, my parents had to know. They needed to know. She goes, so I was preparing to come out to my parents. And she said, I was preparing myself to lose my parents in order to be with my son. And kind of what that was like. She goes, when they talk about this being a choice, like who would ever choose, right? Who would ever choose this? She goes, and I have so much more of a respect for my son now because I know that fear. And it wasn't even my story to tell. And that was really interesting as she began preparing herself to have a split from her parents and to break that relationship if that's what it came down to. The next one was, or the final theme that came from this was an increased complex understanding of their gay and lesbian family member. And basically out of that meant because of what happens when somebody is openly gay, or they're, openly with their partner or whatever, the kind of criticism that you get open up to, the kind of challenges that you have. And then you have this idea of your faith that you're trying to weave into this. People just started experiencing, there's just so much more complex. I just didn't know I thought it was really simple that you're just gay. And one of the sub-themes that came out of this was that God too felt that way. God had more concern for these individuals because of the complexity, because of the social pressures for these individuals. And how that was kind of a reflection of one of the sub-themes of faith, as well as one of the themes of their family relationships, is that complexity and really seeing their family member in a different light, a little bit more complicated. So overall, those were the 9 themes that came out. I had 7, like I said, semi-structured questions. I had a few sub-themes, but I really just wanted to relay the bigger ones. The limitations, one of the limitations that I would say from having done this is I met the gatekeeper early when I was in school, and I didn't start collecting data till later, and so much had changed because the congregation had continued to suppress conversation. And so some had just left, some were so bitter they didn't want to talk anymore. So I was left with a smaller number of people who wanted to talk. One of the girls I asked, I said, well, how are you feeling about the church right now? And she was like, I have a righteous anger and I totally feel justified in it. And then, and that was kind of interesting to hear because there were just so many emotions, you know, and some were like, I don't even talk anymore. And then I'm angry and yes, I want to talk. And other people are like, I'm just kind of resolved, you know, it is what it is. So the limitation was how much time. And then I was also hoping to get more of a bandwidth of the GLBTQI spectrum. I only ended up with gay and lesbian individuals with parents, but I would really have liked to talk to some transgender parents and queer and questioning. I would really have liked to have had more of a little bit more of a diversity. So the future directions, and I think why this is important is because there's even being some research right now out in Seattle about the impact of the purity movement on millennials. They're finding some really interesting findings on that. And I think that it would probably be really interesting to look at the subject of gay and lesbians, or really LGBT, the whole community, inside those individuals who experience the purity movement. Just to see how they worked through it, or if they did. How many of those individuals who were raised in that are still in the church? Like, I think it would be a good topic just to understand.
Sorry, I need Play-Doh.
That's okay. There you go.
The whole thing. Yeah.
Play-Doh break.
It's just for me.
The therapist needs Play-Doh. That's funny. Another area that I would really like somebody to look into, because I'm done with research, this will never happen again. I have a very good friend of mine who's a rabbi, and she has said in didactics before that often one's theology reveals more about them than God. And a lot of times there's the old saying in Christendom that we made God in our own image. And there were about 2 themes that came out that individual participants reported that they feel this, and then it showed up later that God felt this. And so, like the one about I have more complex understanding and I have more concern for my family member, so does God. And having that kind of teased out and seeing what the correlation is there. What's that relationship about? The next area that I thought would be interesting is the concept of secrecy. So many of them felt that in the church they were forced to be secret. And one of the moms shared that she had developed strategies in which to approach people about the subject and even talk about the way she talked about her children, because she was fearful. And again, this was a mom who's been in the congregation for 20 years. So how do I now, with people I trusted, how do I now develop strategies in which I can have conversations with people, and what that does to faith, and really, what does that teach younger children growing up, you know, these things that you hide, and yet God knows everything, right? So like, when you're raised in one of those traditions when God is omnipotent, like, how do you reconcile that? We hide from people of faith, and yet we're supposed to have open and authentic relationships with people of faith, and God knows everything, but we don't talk about certain things. And then part of that too is families reported so much of a strength and a bond that happened because of those conversations, that in a world that is increasingly becoming more connected through globalism and media and everything else, does the church weaken itself by not allowing conversation, by stifling conversations? How does it actually cripple itself? The next was assumptions and what happens when we make assumptions about people, right? I can be in a church for 20, 30 years, and as long as you think my children are straight, or my child is cisgender, right, or my brother is cisgender, we're okay. But when that's not happens, like, and we form our faith around those assumptions that we make about people, what does that do? And then the final theme, or not thing, excuse me, the final reason that I thought this was important, again, because for therapists, we don't get a lot of education around theology and around people's faith. And we sometimes tiptoe around it because we don't want to offend them, or we don't understand it, or we think it's so crazy, right? That you just don't even want to open that can of worms. And then on the other side, clergy get very little training around behavioral sciences. And one of the books that I used was kind of like the Bible of affirmative therapy. And I looked for everything that I could find on parents. And even in that affirmative therapy handbook that counselors use for family therapy, it was about, I found probably about a paragraph that talked about family members. It's just not something that we talk about. And if churches suppress conversation, if those individuals, those family members suppress conversation, because it becomes really from the perspective of the person who's gay or lesbian, it's really help me feel better about what you do, not really about who you are. That's a lot to have to explain to somebody. Where do these individuals go? Where do they go to be heard? Where do they go to work out issues of faith? Where do they go to work out these issues of how do I love my children? Maybe I don't agree with my child. Where do I go do that? And like I said, having lived this experience, there's not many places they can't. So they come to you, and then you have to explain yourself. And so that's where I would like to see future direction go. Is there to be more training? And it is addressed really in more lines of family therapy, that there needs to be more education, just even around GLBT stuff, but specifically around religion and spirituality, that just even an awareness of what people bring in and how they hold ideas and how they hold concepts. So that was what I have spent the last 2 years or so working on. So any questions about any of this?
Well, I think you sort of covered this. I was missing the voices, and you said why that happened, who are more in the middle of the conflict, and the people who end up resolving by getting narrower.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like people are willing to talk to you because they were getting through it.
Right.
And they were able to process it.
Right.
And come out with some positive things.
I did have one outlier.
Did you?
Yeah, so one of the questions was, in my defense, was, what do you think you would have done had you not taken the Presbyterian, a group that's really pretty Calvinistic, which is meaning that there is a lot of emphasis on science and reason, and you have critical thinking, versus I'll speak from the tradition I was raised, if you looked at Southern Baptist, or if you looked at Assembly of God, if you looked at some of those individuals. And I said, I didn't look at those individuals, but from my own experience, I think you have more somatic issues. I think there's more emotional suffering. But there was one outlier from this individual or this presentation, and it was a sibling, and it pretty much narrowed down because she became more narrow.
Right.
And it was one of those things where she pushed and pushed and pushed her family, and the parents basically, we love you both, and we're just going to agree to disagree. And it was really interesting because I actually interviewed the parents, and then I interviewed her because a lot of these individuals were related. From her mind, it was not solved. There was things that she was not allowed to talk about. But when I talked to the parents, they felt like it was, well, we've just agreed to disagree. So it's not that big of an issue. But with her, it was still an issue. So they definitely were not thinking that, they thought that they were on the same page with each other, and they weren't. No. And she very much went way more narrow, way more conservative. So.
Yeah, that was just kind of one of the things I was wondering too, if you'd come across with all the people in that, looking at their assumptions and scripture and beliefs and now your experience of how those come together or don't, how you choose to deny one or the other. Sounds like you found a lot of people that were able to kind of blend those
Right.
in their talk. But
Right. Because the concept of God changed.
Yeah.
God got bigger. God got this. And one of the mothers was just really forthcoming. She was like, if I go down this journey and I can't find support, then my faith has to go. If this is about my child or faith, it's going to come down to my child. And if God wants that conversation, she said, this is a direct quote, if God wants that conversation on Judgment Day, then he can have it. I thought, okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was only the one outlier, and like I said, I was very, very, very careful not to put any names, any kind of identifying information, because they definitely thought that they had agreed on something, and they had not. So.
Were you primarily interviewing then, not the person that came out in the family, but their relatives?
Yes, these were moms, dads, and siblings. Everybody biological. So they had shared living space. They had. So.
I think it's great research. I'm glad you did it. I'm glad you prevailed.
Thank you. I would love it if they would start. I'm hoping that this creates a little bit, because a little bit of interest, because like I said, I could only find one study that had anything to do with what I wanted to do. But I would really love to see them or somebody to do a study on the more conservative evangelical branch of Christianity.
Well, and these are the questions that both, people in the, LGBTQ community, like yours, you're coming out, you're wondering what's going to happen in my family, and
Right.
families are wondering, what do we do now?
Right.
And everybody's got the questions, and nobody knows where to go.
Right. When I had to kind of search for literature to kind of squeeze into this, and it makes sense that individuals, particularly the research that says that more individuals who live in the Bible Belt, right, the South and Texas and Arkansas, that kind of area, along with the other southern states, is that those individuals, those gay and lesbian individuals, have experienced more depression, right, more anxiety, suicidal attempts, suicidal thoughts. And I really do believe if we were to look at those more conservative groups, I think you would see a lot more of those responses. I did not hear I heard a lot of anger. I heard some sadness, but I did not hear people talk about, I went into a deep depression. I went into the state, where I was anxious and I cried for, I didn't hear that. It was, these individuals went really to the head. And, which was what one of the professors in my defense said, what would happen had you not been with a group that's so Calvinistic? And I'm like, that's what I think.
Yeah.
I think it would be way more somatic and way more mental health symptoms, actually. So.
And then a therapist not asking these questions would come at it from, how do we treat depression?
Right.
How do we treat anxiety when there's, this
Right.
whole area that's just could be kind of missed or just, like you said, not talked about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and how you link, what I think eventually it seems like it'd be great to have a discipline or, the set of questions that helps people move through this.
Mm-hmm.
And not only have a place to go, but a procedure, a little bit of a procedure for guiding processing that helps people integrate, not
Right.
shut down.
Right. Right. And even asking those questions of what you want to happen, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think of, even if you were to ask, and I'll get real personal here for a second, if you were to ask my mother what she would want to happen, right? She would want a full confession and recanting, and that God, that I would change my ways or whatever. Versus if somebody's coming to therapy and it's, with somebody like that, like, I would like to sleep through the night. I would not like to wake up and panic. I would not like to But you're right. If you don't know the underlying stuff about what's going on, you're just going to focus on the symptoms versus what's motivating those symptoms. Yeah. So, I'm really-
Interesting stuff.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I'm really happy it's
Mhm.
over. I'm so happy it's over. And I'm so like, I feel like it's something really small, but I did share a little bit of this with the group because they asked me to. And one of the things that they kind of walked away with is we've learned that we need to stop asking for dialogue at church. We need to stop asking for